I was 47 before Kaylin and I married. And so he was my first. And he had been married before. And when he came back to the Lord, his wife at the time was not interested in making the changes that he was making. So she left him. And so Kaylin was single for 5.5 years before we met. And I would just like to take just a minute and share briefly how that happened, because I was living in Kentucky and he was in North Dakota, and there the twain shall meet unless God does a miracle. My mother had gotten sick, really sick with C. diff, and I moved back here to Alabama for a few weeks to take care of her. And I had been praying for a husband. Friends of mine had encouraged me to join Adventist Singles, but to me, that was dumb. It was kind of like window shopping for a husband, and I didn't have that kind of wisdom. That was my thought on it at the time. And so I chatted with a few guys, but I had told the Lord that I needed to know that we were on the same page spiritually before we could move forward. And I didn't want to talk to anybody on the phone until I knew that by email where they were spiritually. And so one of the profiles that I saw on the Adventist Singles was a really a nice, seemed nice spiritual man, but he lived in North Dakota, and I was not about to move to North Dakota, so I rejected him. And so when I fast forward back to when my mother got sick, when Mom started getting a little bit better, I decided to go over here next door to Uchee Pines, which my parents' farm joins Uchee Pines. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in just a minute. So I went over to Uchee to do a presentation on the sufferings of Christ. I was already traveling and speaking a little bit in ministry. And while I was there, there were two people who had been students of mine when I taught at Uchee Pines back in the early and mid 90s. And they had subsequently gotten married, and he had become a pastor, and they'd traveled all over. Well, before I left, he asked me, "Can I ask you a question?" And it was that tone, that where he's going with this. And so he asked me if he could introduce me to a friend of his. And I told him I wanted to pray about it for a few days. So I did. And when I was about ready to go back to Kentucky, where I was living at the time, I called him up and I said, "Okay, you know this man and you know me. And if you feel that the Lord is impressing you that you need to introduce us, then you can give him my email. Do not give him my phone number. I don't want to talk to him on the phone." So long story short, he did. He gave my email address, and we chatted back and forth on email for, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 weeks. And then I invited this person to be friends on Facebook. I found him on Facebook, but there were no pictures visible because his site was private. And so when he accepted my invitation, I nearly fell out of my chair, because it was that guy from North Dakota that I had rejected on the Adventist Singles site. So I had told the Lord that I needed the 2x4 over the head when the right one came along, and he gave me a cross tie over the head. So it was pretty evident that God had led us together. So I grew up, as I mentioned earlier, in a small farm here in rural Alabama. My family's farm happens to join Uchee Pines. I'm the only Adventist in my family, but that's how I became Adventist. I met people over at Uchee. I used to ride my horse over there. Sometimes on Friday or Sabbath evening, I would run through the woods, and I would stand on the lawn at Anawody, the old lifestyle center, and listen to the scripture songs. And it so moved me to hear the word of God put to song like that. They didn't know I was out there, but that had a profound impact on me. And there's, I'm just going to kind of cut to the chase on that story, but living simply was just a way of life for me. I mean, everybody had a garden, everybody canned, everybody knew how to do stuff. I mean, I grew up driving tractors and breaking horses and just doing stuff. And so it was very normal to me. City life was foreign to me. And my husband grew up on the prairie in North Dakota. He grew up in Goodrich, North Dakota, right smack in the middle of the state. He worked on farms during the summer, and he moved to the city when he grew up. We united our lives September 28, 2012. And we actually, let me back up here. We had, let's see, we met in February, we married in September. We spent a grand total of 8 days together. I don't recommend that, but that's the way that the Lord led us. It made no sense to me. And this is when God started not making sense to me, but it was evident. I knew that this was God's leading. There were so many answered prayers. And so we, during our wedding ceremony, I actually had people tell me after the wedding that that was the most spiritual ceremony that they had ever been to. And I was so happy to hear that, because that was my goal. My heart's desire for uniting my life with Kaylin was that it would make me better equipped for ministry, and it has, and that we would be faithful to work to hasten the Lord's return. So just 2 or 3 hours after this scene right here, we got in the car and we started driving to North Dakota. And at the time, my husband lived in Bismarck, North Dakota, which is the capital. And he had lived in a duplex near to a very nice park in Bismarck. Bismarck is actually, for a city, a very clean, nice city, or it was. It used to be. It's grown quite a bit now. And so we lived for 3 months in this duplex, but I drew the line in the sand during our courtship, and I told my husband, I am not going to live in the city. You're going to have to find us something in the country. And this was during the oil boom in North Dakota, so properties were just being snatched up like crazy. So I want my husband to tell just a little bit of how the Lord actually dropped a country property out of the sky, literally, in his lap. So if you want to kind of share a little bit how that happened.
Well, for me, I had never heard of this thing as country living. I had spent 24 years as a prodigal son. I was raised in the church, but at 18, I left because I didn't really care about God, and I didn't live a very good life. And so when I came back to the Lord, I was starting from scratch. And so country living to me, I thought, well, what's the big deal? Bismarck's not that big a city. It's a very nice city. But I thought, well, if that's what she wants. And I was working for a company where I had over 200 customers, and I would get phone calls quite a bit during the day. And so some of them, if I didn't know who they were, I wouldn't answer them. And so I started my journey on looking for country property.
To rent. We were just looking for something to rent.
Right, just to rent. And so we looked in different places, Bizman Online, different realty places. And I kept getting, during this time, I kept getting a phone call from this number over and over again. And they would never leave a message, and it frustrated me. And so a month and a half went by, and I thought, well, finally, I'm going to answer this phone call. I'm going to see who this person is. So I answered it, and they said, yeah, this is so-and-so. I've got that property for rent out in the country you were looking for. And I thought, okay, I don't know who you are. I don't ever remember contacting them. And so I said, sure. Can I come out and look at it? And he said, yeah. So I went out there to look at it. Very, very beautiful area. My wife comes from where there's a lot of hills and trees, and North Dakota is pretty flat and not many trees, but this area was near the Missouri River, had a fair amount of trees for North Dakota and some hills. So I thought, wow, this is pretty nice. So I went out and I said, how did you get my number? And do you remember how he got my number?
No.
I don't either. I don't know how he got my number, but anyway, I ended up out there. So I know this was a God thing. And so we had talked to him, and he said, well, where are you at now? Well, at that time, we'll get to this, but we were in a trailer court, or at the, we're at the trailer court. No. How did we come up with the rent? Anyways, he was asking, we were thinking of going to a trailer court. That's what it was. Because we wanted out of that townhouse. Was that it?
Yes.
Yeah. But
Trailer
anyway,
court gave me cold
that's where my
chills.
mentality was. But anyway, he asked what you would pay for a lot rent at a trailer court. So I told him at that time, I think it was $250. And he said, well, if you come out here and stay, let's just make it $200. I thought, well, that's pretty reasonable. So anyway,
he added after he said that this was a 200-acre working cattle farm with horses and the whole shebang. And after he said that $200, he said, and if you help me, I won't charge you.
Yeah. So we'll just take it up on your next screen.
Okay. So Kaylin and I, we were dumbfounded. I mean, this just literally dropped in our lap, and everyone had told him, you will never find anything. I mean, the market was just completely saturated with buyers. And so, but this was very clearly God's leading. And so we actually bought this double wide. It was a very nice 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom, large double wide. We got it for a pretty nice price. And this is when it was being set up in December of 2012, and it was so cold. But it's not always cold in North Dakota. It does warm up sometimes. And this, my husband traveled a lot the first couple years of our marriage. And so this was our backyard. And if you don't know anything about North Dakota, and probably South Dakota too, the topsoil is like 6 feet deep. And then on top of that, there was a barn next door, and there was a front end loader, a tractor with a bucket on the front. And my husband brought down all of this composted manure and put on top of the garden, and we were able to till that in. His father gave us a walk behind tiller to use in the garden, and you can see the results. I mean, it was amazing, absolutely amazing. And I was, go ahead.
When people would come out to visit us, their first stop would be to the garden.
They headed straight for the garden. And I gardened it in such a way because I grew up gardening. I raised the beds up so that they would warm up sooner. And I had beets before anybody did. It was so wonderful. I just loved it. And then, of course, there were horses here on the farm too. And this was one of the young colts that they had. And this was the first time we called this little guy Blue. This was the first time he ever had a saddle on him. And because we had gained the trust of these horses, he just stood right there. He didn't flinch. Let me put the saddle on. I love that guy right there. Okay. And then we were there for 2 years and working and doing Bible studies and ministry stuff the whole time we were there. And then my greatest nightmare happened. We were actually out of town when we got a phone call from the landlord, and we had cleaned all this up, this whole lot where it was a mess. It was an old farmstead, and there was junk everywhere, and the trees had not been cared for, and they needed to be trimmed up, and so I just was like a pig in mud, having a blast, cleaning this place up and gardening. And I just felt right at home. And it was such a blessing to me because Kalen was gone so much with his work. And so, being there was just a huge help for me, being away from everyone that I knew. And the winters were so harsh. And, to have this for the summer was a big blessing. But we got a call from the landlord, and he admired our work over there on that side so much that he gave us 6 months to move. He wanted to build a house where our mobile home was sitting. And I was devastated, but, I guess, well, okay, this is what's going to happen. So we tried to sell our mobile home. The oil boom was still pretty much going on. It was beginning to taper off when we put our trailer on the market, but I mean, nobody would buy it. And so we had to pick this trailer up at the cost of $17,000. They wouldn't split it to move it. They picked the whole thing up like a house and moved it. into a mobile home park. And I cried literally for days, probably a week. I cried and I cried and I cried. We lived there almost for a year. And thankfully, though, this was kind of on the edge of town, and we could drive just a little bit, maybe 4 miles or so, and kind of be out in the country where we could walk and just. I started learning more and more about wild edibles while we were here, and then actually the mobile home finally sold. And a friend of ours had just lost her husband, and she was out of town, and she asked us to house sit. So they had a little 2-acre estate just north of Bismarck, and we were able to stay there. And that was very nice because it was surrounded by trees. They had a garden. So that was kind of a little time that I could kind of air out a little bit from having lived in the mobile home park. And then the Lord opened the door for us to move down to Kentucky. I had asked my husband if we could move back home to Kentucky, and he agreed. And I had to rent a house sight unseen that would accept. We for a while we raised border collies, and we had these 2 little puppies. So we needed a place that had a yard that was fenced for our little puppies, and that would accept us with a rent that we could afford. Well, this place was unbelievable. It was a cute little cottage in a beautiful little valley. It did have neighbors on both sides, but they were super quiet and very nice, had a fenced backyard, and they accepted us, and the rent was affordable. And right across the yard, the road from the house was this beautiful creek, and we could walk up and down this creek with the puppies and play. But if you see right here, it says this little rental house, when we walked in, was full of black mold. And at the time, I knew that was not good, but I didn't understand the severity of that. And I didn't understand that you cannot clean that up. You have to rip it out. But thankfully, we were outside most of the time. And so I didn't really start having problems with mold, but I'll come back to that in a little bit. So we were searching for land to buy during this time while we were living in this little rental house. And we bought land about an hour from there. And I happened to have a friend that lived 4 miles from the property that we bought. And it's the lady whose husband in Bismarck had just passed, and this was her home in Kentucky. And so we stayed with her. She welcomed us into her home. She was very gracious, very sweet lady. And we lived there for almost 6 months while we built our home on our property. And my husband was able to, do repairs, and we helped her with, cleaning and getting the firewood in. And it was very nice. We all got along very well. And then we had the farm that we had bought. I absolutely love this place. 25 acres. There were 3 creeks, 5 springs. We were off grid. We had, how many berry bushes did we have?
48 berry bushes, 17 fruit trees, and 3/4 acre of garden, which half of the acre was for our corn and berries. And I think that's all we put in.
Yeah. This big area here, we actually planted mostly our field corn and popcorn and stuff like that there. And then you can see a few people there. This was actually taken during one of our camp meetings. Sharon, we also had camp meetings on our place, and we were pretty primitive. I think this was our first camp meeting that we had. You can see at the right edge, you can see just the edge of our ministry building. Our home was a pole building, a pole barn that we had. The Mennonites came in and built the frame, and then my husband and I finished the house along with some friends that helped us. And then we did the same thing for the ministry building, although it was 20 feet, I think 20 feet longer. Mm-hmm. And we had I think it's still on the YouTube channel, a video where all of our friends came and helped. That was such a great day. At any rate, we had all kind of camp meetings, and here's another aerial of one of our camp meetings. we had classes for homeschoolers. They would bring their kids and we would teach them, gardening and wild edibles and stuff. We had classes on survival and country living. We had Bible studies out there. We were set up pretty primitive. This was our outdoor shower and kitchen. We had an IBC tank mounted up. I don't know, that was probably about 10 feet up.
About that.
Yeah. And we had enclosed underneath here, and there were 2 showers. And the tank would heat up by solar. We painted it black. This was at the beginning here, but we had painted it black, and it would get tepid, and on a hot summer day, it was pleasant. And this was our kitchen area. We had also built a vault toilet. We just had it pumped out by one of those companies that does that after the camp meeting. So then I got sick. This is my hand after one of my hand surgeries. The first thing that happened was in August of 2018. My cat scratched me. And if you haven't heard that story, I ended up with tetanus. And I was on oxygen for about 2 months trying to recover. The Clostridium tetani damaged my intercostal muscles, and I couldn't expand my chest wall. Then in January, ticks are active in the winter down south. I got Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and that made me quite ill. And we just found out about a week and a half ago that this has been active since then and has been causing me a lot of headaches in many ways. And then I ruined my hands. I'm a confessed workaholic. I love to work. I love to accomplish things. And I have had a total of 5 hand surgeries. So the farm became very difficult for us to keep up, but we struggled ahead for quite a while and tried to maintain it. But the Lord made it very clear that we were to sell the farm, and I was heartbroken. We had built this house together, finished the inside and stuff. Were you going to say something?
Well, I'm just going to share a bit. The place, we really enjoyed it for sure, and we learned a lot. I had no carpentry skills before, but did some studying and would help friends doing that as well. But we can get to more of that later. But the one thing I wanted to say was those who are not in the country and are looking for country property, we did look back at, this property, and you've seen the hand surgeries. It was wearing me out too, because we did have camp meetings and we had young children there as well. And we had 3 creeks. And so we wanted to keep everything neat, tidy, clean. We just wanted to have a nice appearance for the neighborhood so that people would drive by, that they would see something different and something special. And we wanted to keep snakes out. You didn't want children bit or ticks. You have to keep all that stuff down. And, just for example, it was 16 hours of weed eating in 1 week to keep the creek beds down and the fence lines and everything. And we'd planted 125 trees on the property. But it really, as we look back at it, as much as we loved it, we learned that we need to take advice. And so we went back to the Country Living book to read it more closely. And one thing I'll say now, and we'll save the rest for later, is that we found out that you are to have a country home with a bit of grassy lawn. We had 6 acres to keep up with the ministry building and ours, and 3/4 acre garden. And it really was too much for just the 2 of us.
Yeah, there was a field back behind the house on the other side of the big creek that thankfully the neighbor mowed it for hay. So that was a blessing. But we listed the farm. We priced it actually a little high for our area. But with everything on the farm, it was worth that, but nothing was selling at that time. This was 2018. And go ahead.
But even with that, we wanted to make sure that this was of God. And so we did ask for a high price, and we said, we're not going to settle unless we get the price we want. Then we will know it is from God.
Right. And you can see here how productive the garden was. I'm a little over 5 feet, 5 feet 1 1/2 inches to be exact. And some of that corn got, I think it was almost 14 feet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was crazy. I mean, we grew some really good gardens there too.
But so
But
people know too, just on that little quarter acre there, we put over 1,800 pounds of amendments on that. So the soil is very depleted. And so you have to do your research too with the soil, to make sure that you're getting food, that contains the minerals that our body needs.
right, we consulted with Bob Gregory. I highly recommend his gardening course if you don't know about gardening and stuff. I really appreciate his approach to gardening. But we listed the farm. As I said, nothing was selling at that time, but it sold within 6 months. And the interesting thing was, because our home was not a conventionally stick-built home, it was a pole barn that had been converted or finished off as a house. Plus, it was off grid. So there were no comps, real estate comparables for that area. So this was going to have to be somebody who didn't need a loan. It was going to have to be somebody who had the cash, and that's exactly what happened. The people who bought it, his son had just been killed in a tragic accident, and they had the money. And so anyway, that was very sad. So as we sold the farm, or when we sold the farm, right about the same time, this property came up on Facebook Marketplace, and it was 120 acres. And we actually invested in this 120 acres because it had such incredible timber value, and we really wanted to have some money to put back into our ministry. And so we bought it to resell, and we were in for a very big surprise, and I'll share more of that later. But it had no house on it, so we had to rent something after we sold the farm. So we rented an old farmhouse, a huge, beautiful cattle farm, not too far from where we lived. There were tons of wild edibles and medicinals, but the house was full of mold, and we didn't know it at the time. And I got super sick. I thought I was going to die. Kaylin was gone most of the time. This is an actual photograph from the basement of that house. If you see this in your home, please don't take it lightly. We had to pack up and leave in a hurry after 8 months because I was so sick. I mean, I just was constantly throwing up, dizzy, headache, all of the symptoms of this chronic inflammatory response syndrome. I had all but one. The only one I didn't have was weight gain.
And I was out of the house most of the time working, but if I didn't have work, or it was raining and I couldn't work, I did carpentry work and handyman stuff. But if I was home more than 2 or 3 days, it affected me as well.
Yeah,
and so it had quite an impact on us.
And just to emphasize this, we lost all of our furniture as a result of this. We had to burn many of our things before we left there. And we rented another double wide on about 2 acres for about 6 months, and I just couldn't get better. And so we had to get rid of the rest of our furniture. We lost all of our furniture as a result of this, but I think God had a plan in that. I was able to save our clothes. I had to wash it a special way, and our books we packed up. Many of them were already packed up, but I just wasn't able to let go of our books. And during this time here, I did not know it, but there were some people in Eastern Kentucky who had been following our ministry, and they invited us to stay in their little 500 square foot cabin. And we thought that it would be maybe 2 or 3 months, and that's what they thought. Well, it turned out to be about a year while we were trying to resolve deed issues on this 120 acres that we bought, which turned out on survey to be 75 acres. We lost 50 acres on this.
It was actually 74 acres. And we learned some very difficult lessons. We had trusted people, and I didn't know how to read a deed. And they claimed, because his father was with him, they claimed that this deed covered both tracts to this land, and we trusted them. And I just want to say, even if they're good people, I'm not saying that they did this intentionally. Perhaps.
We don't know.
We don't know. But even if they're nice people, get insurance, title insurance, and have the deeds checked. As a matter of fact, we have vowed not to buy another piece of property unless it has a survey. And so very expensive and hard lesson for us to
Very
learn.
painful lesson, but it was clear. We felt it was clear that God had led us to purchase this. So that's why it just didn't make sense.
Mm-hmm.
Why, God? Why would we get all set up on this beautiful place and have to sell it? Why are we having to move so much? Why did I get so sick? Why did we lose all this land, on this? And then, finally we just surrendered the whole problem to the Lord. I mean, my husband, he had been to the point where he was just mad at God, because
Well, as a
it was just,
breadwinner, I felt like I just threw our money away, and I was very troubled with it. I had to take it many times in prayer to God, and I was, why? And I've learned now, hindsight, never question God.
that's right. Because when we finally fully surrendered the situation to God, he took the reins, and we have a soul for the kingdom. And in 2 weeks, the man who bought this farm will be baptized. And we are thrilled.
And
Now we understand why.
Thomas and his wife, Sister Nancy, are just two incredibly wonderful people. And so we have two great friends out of this as well.
Yes,
And
amen. Just precious to us.
it's just a blessing beyond anything we could have ever have scripted for ourselves. And yet God knew all along, I've got a plan. And so I'm learning, and this was a great learning experience for me, to trust in God. It may not seem right, it may not make sense, but if your heart is with God and you believe that he is leading, then you need to trust him.
To be aware of new videos like this one, be sure to subscribe to the Preparing for the Time of Trouble channel. For more free videos and downloadable audio podcasts, as well as handouts, go to www.preparingforthetimeoftrouble.com. Topic categories include recordings of live seminar presentations, country living, sustainable gardening, homestead remedies, how to be self-sufficient when the grid goes down, wild edible and medicinal plants, hydrotherapy, and end-time Bible prophecies. To take advantage of these free resources, go to preparingforthetimeoftrouble.com.